Okay, this is the video that I promised you. All right, what we're going to talk about this time is we're going to talk about kind of the relationship between decimals, fractions, and percents. So those are just kind of three ways of telling somebody the same information. Okay, so I'm going to do as usual. I'm going to hopefully share a PowerPoint with you. And we'll see kind of how it goes. All right, let's see if we can do it. All right, so we're talking about rational numbers. Now remember what rational numbers are. They're numbers that can be written or can be expressed as an integer over another integer. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going with it. All right, now let me talk about percents because percents are a little bit different. Percent literally means per 100. Okay, so that's the literal definition of percent is per 100. All right, so that per, and then of course cent is the 100 part. So when you say 12% do something, you mean 12 per 100. In other words, 12 out of every 100 do that thing. Now, one of the most popular ways to kind of illustrate that with elementary students is to show them a grid that's 10 rows and 10 columns. So there are 100 cells, 100 little squares in there, and have them actually color 12 of those. So 12% of that picture is shaded green. So what would half be? Wouldn't half be 50 of them? All right, so you only got 12 of them shaded out of your 100. Okay, so what does 71% mean? Well, 71% means 71 per 100. In other words, 71 out of 100. So I have highlighted in gray 71 little squares out of the total 100 squares. So 71% here is shaded. Now, occasionally, what people get confused are fractions and then fractional percents. So on this one, what if I told you to shade half the picture? So do you understand that you'd have to shade 10, 20, 30, 40, 50? So in other words, you would literally shade half of this picture. All right, so not a really easy way to shade here with this little pencil, but you can kind of see what I'm talking about. So half of this big square, so I'm shading 50 of these squares. So half are shaded and half aren't. Now, what does half a percent mean? Now remember, 1% would mean 1 out of 100. And I'm doing a half of a percent. So isn't a half smaller than 1? So do you understand that really means take a half of one little square? So this is a half of a percent shaded and this is a half shaded. So there's a big difference between the fraction 1/2 and the percent 1/2%. Okay, so there, look at the shading, they're not remotely the same. Okay, so be real careful when you just got a fraction and when you got a fractional percent. So if it were 1%, then I would have shaded that whole thing right there. Okay, but it wasn't even 1, it was half of 1. Okay, so make sure that we're clear about the difference between those two things. All right, now we're going to learn to kind of move, hopefully fluidly. That's what Common Core says. You should be able to move fluidly or fluently between fractions, decimals, and percents. Now think about what fluent means. When you're fluent in another language, it basically means two things. You're accurate and you're fast. Like I can speak a little German, but it'll take me, I've got to think of what's the German word? You know, what's the German word for that? And so I'm not fluent because I'm not quick with it. And there's a lot of things I don't know. So fluent means accurate and quickly. So we want to be able to teach children to be accurate and quickly be able to move among decimals, fractions, and percents. Because sometimes one works better in some settings than another. Like we talked about decimals, you see a lot of decimals in money. Okay, so the first slide is a reminder of something you already have in your notes. How do you change decimals to fractions? You know, or sometimes they're mixed numbers. Well, the first thing you've got to do is correctly read the number. You know, we're not going to say 1.2. All right. Then you simply write on your paper what comes out of your mouth. And remember, the last thing that comes out of your mouth is going to end up being your denominator. because it's the place value of the last digit, and then just simplify it. For instance, look at this one right here. 1.75. Now, how do you don't say 1.75? You say 1 and 75. Now, what place is that 5 in? It's in the hundredths column. So that's why that's red, 1 and 75 hundredths. So you literally just write down 1 and 75 hundredths. Okay. Now you can come over to the side and make a factor tree. Remember, 75 is going to be a 3 times a 5 times a 5. And then 100 is 4 times 25. All right, so if you divide out those ones, that's where the 3/4. So 1 and 3/4 should be my final answer. All right, now how would I read this one? Now remember, normally we don't say 0 and. So if you don't have a whole number, if you don't have a number to the left of the decimal, you just read the number to the right. So that's just 12. All right, and then tenths, hundredths, the last place value is the thousandths. So that's read 12 thousandths. So that's what I wrote down, 12 thousandths. All right, so the last word out of my mouth tells me that denominator. And then I went and made some factor trees. And then again, that's going to divide out to a 1. That's going to divide out to a 1. So I'm going to have a 3 left on the top. And then, of course, 2 times 5 is 10. And 5 times 5 is 25. And 10 times 25 is 250. Now, remember, I changed the order when I was multiplying it kind of in my head. And what properties is I can change the order on multiplication. Commutative property of multiplication. That's right. So we already learned how to do this, but that's a reminder. Well, we all went over how do you change fractions to decimals? Well, you're going to divide the numerator by the denominator. So if I told you 7/20, you would literally go over here and take 7 and you would divide by 20. Now, how many 20s can I pull out of 7? None. Okay. Now, when there's not a decimal showing, where's the decimal understood to be? Remember, it's at the back. Okay. So how many tenths are there in 7? Well, there are none. See, that's another way of writing 7. So I haven't changed the value of the number. And how many 20s can I pull out of 70? Well, I can pull 3 out. All right. So that's going to be a 60. That's going to give me a remainder of 10. Now, again, I can annex some zeros here. All right, so you may need to put, in your notes, go back and remember, it says annex zeros if necessary, and then I can bring that 0 down. And how many 20s can I pull out of 100? Well, I can pull out 5. So that's how I got 35 hundredths for this answer. All right, the same thing here. I'm going to take 52 and divide by 25, and I get 2 and 8 hundredths. Now, remember what we said. If you look at, the thing is reduced, the prime factorization of 20 is 2 times 2 times 5. So remember what that little theorem was. If the prime factorization of that denominator is only 2's and or 5's, this thing's going to terminate. So I knew before I started, this would terminate and this would terminate. But now remember, the prime factorization of 6 is 2 times 3. That's in simplest form. So what do I know? I know this fraction's not going to terminate. It's either going to go on forever or it's going to repeat. And this one repeated. So I put a bar over the part that repeated. All right, again, 8 is 2 times 2 times 2. It's only 2, so I know that thing terminated. So I got 2 and 125 thousandths. All right, so we've already been over how to do that. So hopefully that's not a problem for you. Okay, now this is the part that's new. What if I told you, though, that I gave you percents and I wanted you to change them to decimals? Okay, then what you're going to do is you're going to drop the percent symbol and you're going to divide that number by 100. Now remember, why do you divide it by 100? Because percent means per 100. All right, and when you divide numbers by 100, remember it moves the decimal 2 places to the left. So what does 85% mean? Well, it means 85 out of 100. So I'm going to basically drop this percent sign. So the percent sign goes away. And when I take 85 on my calculator, and when I divide it by 100, it's going to give me this answer right here. Or if I do it by hand. Okay, but again, remember, where's the decimal? And there's not one showing. It's at the end. And dividing by 100 moves the decimal 2 places to the left. All right, same thing. That percent sign goes away. Where's the decimal in the 2? Well, it's at the end. So when I divide by 100, that moves it 1, 2 places to the left. So that's why I get decimal 02, 2 hundredths. The same thing, that percent sign goes away, that decimal goes 1, 2 places to the left. So it's 1 decimal 25, 1 and 25 hundredths. Now, this one's already got a decimal. You know, I've got 0.43%. So that percent sign goes away and that decimal goes 1, 2 places to the left. So decimal 0.043. So how do I read that? Well, that's tenths, hundredths, thousandths. The last digit is in the 10,000ths place. So that's read 43 10,000ths. Okay, so that's how you change percent to decimals. You drop the percent sign, so make sure that the percent sign's not on the answer or it's wrong. And then you divide by 100. In other words, you move the decimal 2 places to the left. Well, now what if we wanted to go the other way? Instead of going percents to decimals, we want to go decimals to percents. Well, we're just going to reverse what we did up here. Instead of dividing by 100, we're going to multiply by 100. So instead of the decimal going 2 places to the left, it goes 2 places to the right. But you can multiply physically by 100 if you get confused. And then you have to add or annex the percent symbol. So on this first one, I'm literally taking 6 hundredths and I'm multiplying by 100. All right. Then I'm marking off my decimal places. So I just get 6. And then I put that percent symbol with it. So it just moves it 2 places to the right. See, it moves it 2 places to the right, 305%. All right, it moves it 2 places to the right. So 13 and 68 hundredths percent. If you get confused on a test about whether it goes left or right, think about one that you know. You know that 25 hundredths would be 25 out of 100. So that would be 25%. So to go from a decimal to a percent, you must move it to the right. And to go from a percent to a decimal, it must go to the left. So if you get confused on a test, then just write an example that you know, and then figure out which way it goes. All right, now we're going to kind of put two things together. What if you have fractions and you want to go to percents? What if I told you to change 3/5 to a percent? Well, you're going to do two things you already know how to do. You're going to change that fraction to a decimal. That's back up here. And then you're going to change the decimal to a percent. That's another slide. So when I take 3 and I divide it by 5, you know, with a calculator or by hand on your test, there'll be part of the test that's with the calculator and part that's by hand probably. I'm going to take 5 and divide it into 3. You know, it doesn't go at all. So again, my decimal goes straight up. So 5 goes into 36 times. So I got 6/10. And then I multiply that by 100, which moves the decimal 2 places to the right, and I get 60%. So when I take 1 and I divided it by 8, I got 125 thousandths. So we already know how to change fractions to decimals, and then we just learned how to change decimals to percents. So 2 places to the right, 12 5/10%. Now 1/3, when you divide the 1/3, you just get a whole bunch of 3s. It just goes on and on and on and on. I'm gonna put dot, dot, dot right there. So I put a bar over the 3 to show myself that it's repeating, but you may need to write it out a little bit, because what happens when you change decimals to percents? The decimal goes 2 places to the right. So that's why it's a 33 to the left. And then again, the 3s are going to go on forever. Okay. But you know, so if you've got a repeating, you need to write out what the repeating looks like for several places. All right, 2 1/4. So 1/4 is 2500. So you can take 1 and divide by 4 and get that decimal. And then when you move it 2 to the right, you get 225%. Well, what if it goes the other way? What if you've got to change percents to fractions? Well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to drop that percent symbol. Like we said, what does percent mean? It means per 100. So that number goes over 100 and you simplify. 22% means 22 out of 100. All right. And then you reduce it using factor trees or whatever you like, but make sure that your fractions in lowest terms. 140% would be 140 per 100. It's always over 100 when you're doing percent. And again, you can reduce that with, prime factorization. You can divide them both by their greatest common factor, which is 20, but don't leave it improper. Change it to a mixed number if you need to. Now, sometimes, when you put it 37 over 100, that's as simple as you can make it. Okay, so sometimes it'll simplify further and sometimes it won't. Now, let me show you something that freaks people out sometimes, but it doesn't need to freak you out. You do it the same way. What if you had 66 2/3% and I told you to change it to a fraction? You always drop the percent sign, and then you always, remember, put it over 100. So all these are going to be over 100. The fact that you've got what's called a complex fraction means that either the numerator or denominator themselves have fractions in them. Just rewrite it the way you wrote it when you were in 4th grade. What does this mean? This means 66 2/3. What's that bar mean? Divided by 100. Then change this. We talked about when you're dividing. We've already gone over that. You have to have fractions. So every whole's got 3 pieces of the same size, and I've got 66 wholes. So when I do, remember, 66 times my 3, I get 18. I get 198. And then I already had 2 pieces. So when I add those 2 pieces, I'm going to have 200 pieces, and it takes 3 equally sized pieces to make a whole. Now, how do you make whole numbers a fraction? You put them over 1. And then remember, you can divide straight across the top. 200 divided by 100 is 2, and 3 divided by 1 is 3. That's easy. I don't want to rewrite it like a multiplication problem because it's so sweet right here. The same thing here. How do you change 5 3/8% to just a fraction? Well, to do that, you put the number over 100. What's that bar mean? Well, if I've got a complex fraction, that bar means divided by. So when I've got a complex fraction, I'm going to rewrite it like a division problem in 4th grade. I change that to an improper fraction. So 43 over 8 divided by 100. Any whole number can put over 1. Now, 43 divided by 100 is not pretty, so I'm going to have to rewrite this one. So remember, the first number stays the same. Division turns to multiplication. It's inverse operator, and then I do the inverse, the multiplicative inverse of this. So I flip it, 1 over 100. And then straight across the top and straight across the bottom. 43 is prime, so I know I can't reduce it. But you can make a factor tree to double check yourself. Remember the very first slide a minute ago, we had a 1/2%. That's not the same thing as 1/2. Let's see what it is the same thing as. So if I want 1/2%, that 1/2, remember, goes over 100. So I rewrite it. That bar means divided by. Remember, how do you make whole numbers fractions? You put them over 1. And 1 divided by 100 is not pretty, so I'm going to rewrite it. The first number stays the same. Division turns to, that should be multiplication. All right, so that's an error, so change that to times. And then I take the reciprocal. And 1 times 1 is 1, and 2 times 100 is 200. So remember, 1/2 of that picture back up here was 50 of them. This would be like if you had 1 out of 200 blocks colored, or half of a block out of 100. Okay. Now, one of the things you got to do on your third test is you have to do all of that. All right. And sometimes I may even put it in a chart, so you have to do them kind of all together. So if I give you 1, you should be able to find the other 2. So if I say 45%, remember, how do we change percents to decimals? We drop the percent sign and we divide by 100. So I'm just going to move that decimal 1, 2 places to the left. So I'm going to get 45 hundredths. Now, if I say that correctly, 45 hundredths, I just write 45 over 100. And now I've got to simplify that. So if I divide both of these by 5, I'm going to get 9/20ths for my final answer. All right, now look right here. That makes, if it's 9/20ths, and I do my division, I'm going to get 0.45. And then 45%. So sometimes you may get lucky, not a lot, but sometimes I may put even the same problem and just give you a different thing to see if you even notice. Now, how do you change decimals to fractions and decimals to percents? It doesn't matter which one you do first. To change decimals to percents, you multiply by 100. So it's going to move the decimal 2 places to the right. So 5%. Now, if you say that correctly, 5 hundredths that's going to reduce to 1/20. All right. Now remember, what's 0.5%? Well, if I change that to a fraction, we already did it up here, go back and look at it, that ends up being 1/200. All right, and if I come somewhere then and go from my fraction to my decimal, I'm going to divide 1 by 200. Now remember, it won't go at all. So I annex a 0, it still won't go. I annex another 0, finally it'll go. I mean, excuse me, it still won't go. And when I annex another 0, it will finally go. So I get 5 thousandths. Then how do I change 1 3/10 to a percent? Well, I multiply by 100. So I get 130%. How do I read that correctly? Well, that's 1 3/10. Now, if they literally want a fraction, that's going to be 13/10. Okay, so if I give you 1 on a chart, you should be able to find me all the rest, and I probably will do a chart like that at some point. Okay, at least on your final exam. Okay, so now this material is not going to be on your third test that's in this video. Okay, but it will be on your final exam. Okay, so if you have any problems, let me know. All right, and I will see you when you get back. Check Moodle. All right, for homework. All right, bye.